We have John Oksanish from Wake Forest University in North Carolina. And title of his talk is How Do You Really Feel? Affect and Horatian Sermo.
Let me thank Chiara and Adrian for organizing this conference during what's been a very trying year for so many of us. And I'd like to express particular gratitude for the opportunity to try out some newer ideas and interests of mine, Horatian sermo, ancient emotion, and notions of satiety and sufficiency in Latin literature. And in fact, it may be that this paper represents something at the start of a larger project on those ideas of satiety and sufficiency. My main case today is that affect offers a powerfully productive lens through which to read certain unresolved tensions that are baked into Horatian sermo, and that Horace Epistles 1:1 in particular simultaneously describes and performs, that is, it tells about and shows how we interpret and represent what Greg Sigworth in An Inventory of Shimmers calls the world's apparent intractability, and the body's role as a bellwether in its ongoing immersion in and among the world's obstinacies and rhythms. And to give you some sense of where the paper was going to go, I'll start by talking a little bit about kind of satire, sermo in general, the concept of satis, sufficiency, and then moving into analysis of Epistles 1:1. But speaking of the world's obstinacy and rhythms, this particular conference seems especially timely. So many of the emotional changes brought on by lockdowns and continued uncertainty regarding the pandemic have manifested in the body. The American Psychological Association has noted drastic and continuing disruptions in Americans' habits around diet, sleep, and consumption of alcohol since the start of the pandemic. Salient about these changes, and relevant to the conference's remit, is that all of them manifest as behavior in the body and in the dysregulation of appetites, the body's needs and desires in particular. This is not to say that some of the stressors, or in terms of affect theory, impingements, do not have a cognitive antecedent, only that the body has its own ways of reacting, if not feeling or knowing. For certain emotions are very much known by the body, and some of the most primal, such as basic forms of disgust, seem to have little to no obvious cognitive component whatsoever. And on this point, I'll direct you to the excellent summaries of Korsmeyer, 2011, and the introductory essay of Latiner and Spitharis in their 2017 collection of essays. In short, aberration in appetite suggests simply that the body feels that it needs something that the cognitive mind does not, revealing a basic incommensurability, if not incomprehensibility, between the two systems. Of course, then, these behavioral changes, when viewed as problems, are hard to think one's way out of. There is no easy way to put mind over matter, since cognition alone will struggle to solve a problem of the body. Well, what a pity then that the application of the rational mind to regulate the desires of the body lies at the heart of the Western philosophical tradition. For the Stoics, and we just heard about some of this from Monica, desire itself is an act of reason, insofar as Stoicism sees desires as impulses to which a person assents with one's rational commanding faculty. Reason, or in modern psychological terms, cognition, will discern the difference between a good and a bad desire, and presumably the proper limits of sufficiency and satiety on the path to virtue. Even Epicurus, for whom the fulfillment of necessary and natural desires is expected and good, even Epicurus clarifies that some desires are irrational and must therefore be thought into submission in order to avoid anxiety and in order to achieve atraxia, equanimity. Yet to assert mind over matter, or to put it less elegantly, to regulate embodied desires and fears via cognitive means, is often easier said than done. Perhaps no voice captures this ambivalence regarding the salves of philosophical dogma as does Horace. Though once caricatured as the Epicurean par excellence, Horace is increasingly seen as a purposeful eclectic. And as I argue below, his faith in philosophy overall to regulate appetites and achieve peace of mind is something of an open question. To be sure, Horace is never a philosopher in the strict sense, right? He's a philosophically informed poet. But by standing at the interstices of poetry and philosophy, Horace is well placed to interrogate the limitations of rationality and cognition in the broad sense when it comes to settling feelings in the body. This philosophical diffidence is felt most keenly and perhaps somewhat ironically in Horace's hexameter poems, the satires and epistles, which all fall under the rubric of sermo. They're unified by shared meter, basic discursive positionality, and by a shared and consistent interest in the nature and regulation of appetites. I can speak of one's appetites because although Horace the poet, or poetic persona, often appears to offer advice to others about how to live under various moral and social impingements, it's also the case that much of what Horace has to say in Sermo is at least partly self-directed, a sort of a case of physician, heal thyself. Now, scholarship has already produced some admirable studies on the links between Roman satire, social protocols, constraints, and bodily appetites in the work of Susanna Brand and Barbara Gold, Emily Gowers, and Kirk Freudenberg, to name a few. These studies rightly share a basic awareness that as a genre, Roman satire was thematically characterized by a preoccupied awareness and attentiveness of bodily appetites. But these studies also share, at least broadly, a sense that Horace's references to the body are generally symbolic. That is, the references represent something other than their affective intensities per se. Examples abound, but the most convenient are his frequent mentions of his conjunctivitis, Horace's mentions of conjunctivitis, that is, which are often read as a metaphor for political incompetence, as it was in Athens. Horace's wet dream in Satires 1:5 is another fine instance, but I've had to cut this for time. Now, these readings are keen, but they're also strongly paranoid or suspicious. Now, were all poetry merely ludic, a form of play and an opportunity to display erudition, this outcome would perhaps be an acceptable one. But if we are to look for slightly less paranoid alternatives, as does this paper, to reading Sermo, affect theory holds interest as a kind of post-critique in which attention to the ways a text constructs emotion through reference to the body or by using the body can be prioritized alongside the more traditional archaeology of allusions and formal analytical practices. Important to my study is the programmatic importance of the Latin word satis to satire, and thus to sermo. The term represents a state of fulfillment or enoughness, and its achievement appears to be the goal that Horace's philosophically informed sermons chase. Its verbal resemblance to satura or satira, moreover, made it ripe for exploitation by Horace as he sought to reinvent the genre. His 17 satires contain the term satis 20 times, slightly more than once per poem. Now, there's a lot to say about the term satis, but in this paper, I can only emphasize that when Horace invokes enoughness via satis, concerns for the regulation of the body are often not far behind, albeit in unexpected ways. For instance, in his definition of the style that's appropriate to satire in Satires 1:4, Horace indicates that it's not enough, non satis est, to make verse from the basic words that one might deploy in conversations from everyday life. You can see that there in front of you. In poetry of the sort that Horace has in mind, one should not display anger as might a father in comedy or in real life, fuming at his disobedient or reckless son. The verb indicating anger here is stomachetor, dissociating the emotion from the realm of cognition or ratio and grounding it in an imbalanced humor relationship, probably bile, in the comic father. Interestingly, Horace negatively correlates this raw emotion deriving from bodily imbalance and bilic excess with poetic sufficiency. That is, for a character to get one's bile up in a work of poetry in the same embodied manner in which he might do in real life somehow negates the utterance's potential as special speech. It's as if the circuit breaker for persuasive mimesis, one that's nominally aimed at nudging the reader humorously toward ataraxia in the satires, has been overloaded and shut down. Also important, but neglected in considerations of the importance of satis and satire, is its conceit of objectivity. When satis sufficiency is reached, one needs nothing more, full stop. We may contrast this with the admittedly much rarer term aphatim, which suggests subjective fulfillment of a need or desire. The objective conceit of satis is perhaps clearest in the domain of which is Morris, since one either has enough food and water to subsist or does not. This limit, finis, is determined by natura, as are the limits in all things. However, there are two problems, and surely more, that arise from the promise of an objective sufficiency. First, Horace's extension of a natural and objective category to socially determined ones is alarming and tendentious. What is enough money, say, in a world such as Horace's, which places demands on him as a client that go well beyond the boundaries that are set by nature? Second, the conceit of objectivity implies discoverability. If the truth is out there, then one must find it. And this is an exhausting proposition in a culture that Horace sees as infected with relativism, in which men deceived by desire rate their worth according to their possessions. Anyone who thinks that they have found the answer to satiety and despise their peers on account of their failures will be chastened by Horace's postscript to the story of Tantalus in Satires 1:1, as Tantalus vainly tries to fulfill his desire for satiety, to slake his thirst with water that ever recedes. Why do you laugh at him? Horace asks. The name has been changed, but you're the one the story is about. Horace ends this first diatribe satire with the declaration, enough already, jam satis est. I'll not add any more, lest you think I'm cribbing the notes of Crispinus, a prominent Stoic. Indeed, scholars have seen the reference to Crispinus as a wry send-up of Stoic prolixity, one meant to emphasize the difference between the jovial Horace, a man who knows what is satis, who knows the limits of what his audience can tolerate, and the biting, dogmatic drivel of the Stoics and the diatribe tradition of them and the Cynics. The only problem is that, while yes, the first satire may end, Horatian's sermo does not. And as I hope to show in the second half of this paper, Horace's grasp on philosophical sufficiency continues to vex him, so much so that it threatens to undermine his famed ataraxia. Okay, so now on to Epistles 1:1. The decade intervening between the publication of the second book of Satires and the first book of the Epistles saw the emergence of what is probably Horace's most celebrated work, his first three books of lyric odes. But rather than limit or diminish Horace's interest in questions of sufficiency, satiety, and well-being, his lyric success and his evolving relationship with Maecenas seems only to have heightened those concerns. Crucial is the first poem in the collection, a lengthy recusatio to Maecenas, in which Horace demurs to write any more versus et ludicra. I'll take that as a hendiadys, sort of playful verses, for his patron, instead turning to serious matters. What is true and what is fitting? That's what I'm interested in and what I'm asking about, and I am completely in it. That's in lines 10 there, and line 9 and 10 there. In practice, this means further engagement with philosophical schools, such as Stoicism and the hedonist Cyrenaics. But Horace's abjuration of play invites us to read these poems with less suspicious eyes and to leave behind, as much as possible, our most paranoid critical habits. In the epistles, unlike perhaps the odes, sophisticated and self-fulfilling literary games are not the point of performance. Rather, we are enjoined to listen carefully to what Horace has to say for himself and to attend to the poem's affective features. The balance of the poem, Epistles 1:1, demonstrates that we are, in theme as well as in form, in the domain of sermo. Horace sees a fickle populace, quick to follow the latest trends and consumed as ever with the pursuit of wealth. But two features of the collection, and especially the first poem, set the epistles apart from the satires. First, the poems in the collection, and especially the first, foreground a complex sort of kura, which I'll translate either as concern or anxiety. On the one hand, kura is necessary to resolving ethical conundra, and thus one hopes to reduce anxiety. Right, so we have kuro in line 11, kuro et rogo. I'm concerned about these philosophical questions. But on the other hand, kura becomes a source of disquiet itself, a kind of meta-anxiety. Kura, I suggest, is an appetite or a desire like any other, and it matters little whether the kura is for wealth or for objective satiety and equanimity. The second feature of the epistles is the way in which the body, not the mind, is made to manifest clearly symptoms of anxiety, including of this metakura, resulting in rather unsettled conclusions. For example, that given the ineluctability of what is satis, the philosophical salves that Horace explores and which are tools of the cognitive mind are ultimately insufficient. To take the second part first, for example, of embodied emotion, we can see how early in the poem, and thus the start of the philosophical inquiry in the epistles, Horace situates himself as a surprisingly passive and mercurial object in the philosophical space, tossed about on the sea like Odysseus, or maybe like Cork, thinking here of what Alex said yesterday, or on Friday. Quo mecumque rapit tempestas de flor hostes, that's line 15 there. Sometimes he's flexible, sometimes he's rigid, flipping back and forth from stoic hardness to the Cyrenaic Aristippus, trying to put matters, race, under his own control rather than being controlled by them. Such passivity has an apparent virtue, like the tree that bends but does not break, but it's also unsettling insofar as it's open-ended, not bounded by finesse of any obvious sort, and thus disconcertingly far from the objective satiety that Horace had previously promised. In short, in Epistles 1:1, we find a curious and ultimately unresolved tension between desire for control over the self, which is marked in the poem by continuous use of the verb rego and congeners, and on the other hand, a certain level of resignation, like we see in De Furor. As we turn to more precise relations between the body and mind in the epistle, Horace clearly attributes bodily suffering to dysregulation of desires, which he claims to be able to mitigate if only the audience lends a receptive ear. This you see now in front of you. I'll read Davies' translation altered. Is your heart hot with greed and wretched desire? I have some verba et voces, by which you can soothe this pain and put aside the better part of the disease. You're swollen with praise? There's a set of rituals that will be able to restore you once you read the booklet 3 times and simply. Hateful, angry, lazy, wine-soaked lover? No one is so wild that he can't be tamed if he just lends his ear to prudence. Horace doesn't specify, but it seems all but assured that the libellus to which he refers is the book of epistles, through which Horace speaks to the reader. And I use the word speak advisedly here, for remarkable about this poem is its insistence that it be read aloud. Earlier in Epistle 1:1, he had spoken of his own clean ear, his aurem purgatam, anticipating the reader's own receptive ear here. He thereby emphasizes the importance of oral and embodied performance and reception. What's more, these verba and voces are complemented by piacula, thrice repeated, which evokes ritual, arguably the most powerful form of culturally encoded embodied cognition. The introduction of embodied cognition here suggests that despite the poem's reputation as an invitation to philosophy in the traditional cognitive sense, Horace also gives prominence to the body as a way of knowing what's true and decent, to recapitulate the words from the beginning of the letter. The end of the epistle seems to suggest a similar notion, reflecting on the health of the ultimate self-regulator, the Stoic, sage or sapiens. Horace notes that such a person is just short of becoming Jupiter. He's free, respected, beautiful, indeed a king of kings, again the Rex language, who is above all sound, sanus, except when bothered by a cold. The trick here is that sanus, good health, may refer to physical or spiritual well-being, an important ambiguity that Horace plays with in his reference to pituita, a state brought on by an imbalance of bodily humors, and we'll touch on that again later. As for the second feature of the letter, the importance placed on cura per se, I've already briefly noted its centrality to Horace's aims when he claims to be entirely consumed by the cura of what's right and true. Such cura is prima facie positive in light of its aims, though its shadow rears its head in the diatribe portion of the epistle, in which Horace offers caricatures, in a sort of generic second person singular, as he often does, a caricature of the sort of person who might benefit from Horace's verba and voces and piacula. This is the stock figure of the traitor in lines 42 through 8, who struggles in his head and his heart, his animus, to avoid what he thinks, emphasis added, to be evils. That's to say, a low net worth and electoral defeat. The traitor bears fire and the terrors of maritime travel in order to enrich himself, as if this would allay his anxieties. Now, editors traditionally place a stop after Ignis in line 46, so that the lines read as if the final clause, so that you don't care about the things that you foolishly admire and desire, describes why the merchant ought to listen to Horace's words. In other words, don't you want to listen and learn and trust your better so that you don't care about these things? But it seems equally likely that the clause depends on the merchant's motivations for his mock epic journey, as if he were running off to India, fleeing poverty on the sea through fire and rock, so that you don't care about the things you foolishly admire and desire. Either placement of the clause represents the merchant's wish to avoid poverty, but the latter, which I'm proposing, highlights the inherent ambiguity of kur itself. If security, right, is the absence of worry, then the merchant is seeking it out by means that are at cross purposes with the stated ends because they create more anxiety. The difficulty we face in placing the clause is symptomatic of a larger problem posed by the epistle, in which, given the absence of punctuation or clear cue, it's often hard to determine whether any given remark represents Horace's own point of view or a caricature of a more extreme version of a philosophy that Horace might endorse in moderation. Horace's avowed philosophical flexibility exacerbates this feature of the poem, which affects our ability to judge whether Horace is really able to maintain an independent and aequus animus in the face of evident impingements. This uncertainty, I think, marvelously reflects Horace's own diffidence. And to illustrate this point, let's consider the continuation of his diatribe on wealth. This begins not with Horace's words, but those of Janus, a jingle that's sung in reply by young and old men alike. O cives, quaerenda pecunia primumst, virtus post numos, right? Money first, virtue later. The next 7.5 lines mostly satirize this way of thinking. Judging one's worth by Janus's metric takes no account of other important qualities such as lingua and fides. Making matters worse, the followers of Janus are supported by a popular and stoic-sounding schoolboy rhyme, Anania, offering, quote, a rein to those who do right, Rix eris aiunt si recta facies, that's 59 and 60 there. Again, perhaps evoking the importance of embodied cognition. Now, this punning aphorism can be read in two contradictory ways. In the first naive sense, those who do right, who pursue virtue, are rewarded with a kingdom like that of the Stoic sage, who at the end of the poem, as we've seen, is assimilated to a king of kings. And so Mayer, in his commentary, sees the jingle as a corrective to the popular and misguided view. The jingle is sort of like truth from the mouth of babes. In the second sense of the phrase, however, and one I think is unavoidable given the poem's negative stance toward wealth, the phrase might suggest a kind of Gordon Gekko version of the adage that God helps those who helps themselves. In other words, make money and be a king because greed is good. Perhaps on account of this ambiguity, Horace continues to provoke his reader. Are they persuaded by someone who parrots the notion that money is to be sought first, by the followers of Janus, or by someone more like the Horace of the epistles, who enjoins the reader to be free and upright and to respond to his circumstances accordingly? Now, it's important that I read this bit in Latin, so follow along with the English in the English if you can. I'm sorry that actually now the English didn't make it there, but it's on line 65, starting there. So let's see. Isne tibi melius suadet qui rem facias, rem si posses recti sidnon quocunque modo rem ut propias spectes lacrimosa poemata pupi, anqui fortunae te responsare superbae, libret e rectum praesens hortatur et aptat. In short, are you going to listen to someone who says, money, 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 make money, so that you can see the poems and plays of Pupius more closely, or to someone who's kind of nudging you to be resilient in the face of Fortuna? Now, these lines manifestly illustrate the importance of reading aloud, which in this case reveals two features that I find crucial to the poem as a repository of shimmers or intensities. First is the way that Horace's hexameter, already chatty in sermo, marches along enthusiastically but haltingly on account of the intraclausal interruptions, qui, rem facias, rem, and the repetition of rem, particularly at the line ending, which is not unheard of in Latin poetry, but the monosyllable is certainly marked and it creates a kind of awkward caesura. The other feature of the passage is the striking alliteration, especially of S and labial plosive P and T. What are we to make of such features? Though it would be desirable for our purposes to know that halting hexameters are associated with a particular emotion, an uneven line in the poetic corpus per se suggests a sudden imbalance of corpus in the poet. And how could we expect anything other than an imbalance? On the one hand, the walks and the wherever that these lines offer are the words of Horace, since he is the poet, right, who's written them. On the other hand, these words ventriloquize a greedy caricature, rem, rem, rem. That can't really be Horace, for they don't represent a view that he would seem unbalanced to endorse. Not only is his poetic persona thereby fractured into incompatible opposites, but the sarcastic adoption of other voices strongly recalls that more biting and snapping feature of angry cynic diatribe, a style that, according to Horace and his satires, negated the poetic potential of the utterance. The connotations of excessive alliteration in poetry are more commonly known to us, but any negativity that we feel as Latin aesthetes is here complemented by more local concerns, particularly in line 67. Ut propias spectes lacrimosa poemita pupi. The basic notion seems to be that those who chase money will, of course, enjoy certain material and social benefits. In this case, the orchestra seats granted to wealthy equestrians by the Lex Roscia Theatralis. But such benefits, Horace suggests, are ultimately worthless. You may get good seats, but all you get to see are the pathetic plays of Pupius. We don't know much about him, but it seems that Horace does not value him so much as an artist. More than that, when one thinks of the context of any live theatrical performance and the consequences of sitting in the front row, one immediately recognizes a certain humor in the lines, which, when read aloud with any enthusiasm, risk the production of a certain amount of spit, right? All those P's. So when we read with the body, we notice that the greedy may get a bit more than they bargained for. Not only do they suffer through Pupius plays, but they get an unexpected sprinkling. Now, we could have a laugh at these uppity equestrians and leave it at that. And surely the lines are meant to elicit humor, which regularly serves in sermo to blunt the sharp edge of whatever moral criticism is being directed our way. Even so, we should be reminded of Horace's suggestion in the satires that when we laugh, we do so from our own ignorance and discomfort, because the story is really about us. I think, however, that in this case, the humorous story is also about Horace, and it has less to do with a desire for wealth than the destabilizing power of Kura in any sense. Spitting in Greek and Roman antiquity was associated with a variety of emotions, but as a physiological response that breaks the barrier of the body, it maps onto a set of responses commonly associated with the most primal of embodied emotions, such as disgust. It's not the only one, but it's prominent. It was also associated with anger and was thought to be an apotropaic gesture. To spit 3 times, thinking about reading that book 3 times, particularly into the breast, was thought to divert bad magic or omens, curses, and the like. Such associations therefore suggest that Horace's spitting out of the views of the greedy equestrians operates on several levels simultaneously. On the one hand, we may have a laugh, as we should, at the consequences faced by those who cannot control their desire for wealth. On another, we may laugh at the voice of the cynic moralizer, his feathers all ruffled, rem, 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 Pupius, as he rails against greed. The laughing stops, however, when we realize that this moralizer is actually Horace, his humor's all out of balance, the cynic caricature now cracking his balanced, jovial exterior, like the suitors of Odyssey 20, laughing with a mouth that's not his own. Is this the price of carrying an all-consuming kura for what is decent and true while still living in a world of appetites and desires from which Horace cannot distance himself? Something of an answer comes at the end of the poem, where Horace reflects on the state of his own mind, full of contradictions. Maecenas, he says, laughs or gets angry, stomacheris, if Horace gets a bad haircut or if a worn-out tunic peeks out from under an ill-fitting toga. That is, if external aspects of Horace's care of himself are off balance. But Maecenas won't bat an eye or call a doctor when Horace's ever-present anxiety to discover and pursue what is true and decent is made manifest. So here I'll read Davies' English. How do you take it when my judgment is at odds with itself, disowning what's desired, eager to reclaim what it lately rejected, ebbing and flowing and clashing with the whole system of life, knocking down, building up, and changing squared around? You think I'm sick over the usual things and neither laugh nor believe I need a doctor or a guardian appointed by the praetor. Here, there is a strong suggestion that the health of the mind and body are inextricable, though Maecenas seems not to recognize as much, since he writes off Horace's symptoms as little consequence to himself as a patron, right? So, insanire solemnia, the usual madness for Horace. Horace, on the other hand, knows the severity of his disease, which he shares with a sage of the Sapiens, who, as we've seen, is above all healthy, sanus, unless pituita, phlegm is affecting him. Now, commentators have suggested that the reference to pituita there in the last line indicates simply that Even Sapiens gets a cold, a jibe at tiresome Stoic disquisitions about indifference to illness, which a runny nose commonly figured. That's quoting Mayer. The reference surely. First, Horst has made clear to us that bodily symptoms have emotional origins, not the other way around. That is, the heart boils because greed and wretched desire has affected it, not because it's already ill. In that case, what bothers the sage, as Horst figures him, is not the pituita itself, rather some underlying emotional cause. In Hippocratic humoral theory, pituita was generally associated with a phlegmatic state, kind of slowness and withdrawal. But in Horace, the presence of phlegm was often coincident or antecedent to illness of the stomach and bile. In Satires 2:2, clogging phlegm after a meal unsettles the stomach. And similarly, Cato recommends cabbage juice as a laxative that will clear so much bile and mucus that the patient will wonder himself where it all came from. Pituita, then, is a more complex humor than meets the eye. Through its association with bile in the stomach, it also can be symptomatic of anger. The word, too, is onomatopoetic, deriving from sputum, or spuo, and cognate with the Greek ptuo, meaning to spit, the importance of which we've already seen in the context of Horatian anger. So, all this is to say that the sage does not so much suffer from a cold, but rather an internal state of imbalance, perhaps of anger that is manifested in and known by the body. But before we laugh too hard at the Sapiens, as he falls victim to what he thought he had mastered, that's to say his desires and emotions, we should take a look at ourselves. Else we might find ourselves like Horace, consumed by a mindful search for enough moral outrage or the right way to put mind over matter, when in fact our body has other ideas. Jam satis est. Thanks.